So welcome to Module 6. Module 6 is entitled Entities, one word which hides a degree of complexity, but also a degree of power when it comes to Oracle Intelligence Advisor. In the previous modules, we looked at creating attributes, we looked at writing rules, and we looked at using functions that did smart things with those attributes. Entities will take us to the next level as far as being able to create powerful and rich experiences for our consumers. So, now, entities. So what are we talking about? First of all, why do they exist? They're there because they're often the building blocks of integration with other applications. If we think about, for example, a customer relationship management system or a customer experience or ERP, they often have concepts which we've probably heard of, like you have orders, order lines, customers, service requests, activities. And each of these things has its own discrete set of data. An activity has a start time and an end time. A customer has a name and a customer number. And when you start talking about those sort of models of different objects, you're quite close to what we would call an entity in Intelligent Advisor. They help us build more powerful projects because they allow us to obviously work with a more complex model where we talk about not just the candidate, but maybe the examinations they've taken, but also the aircraft types that they're familiar with. And they're also often almost imposed upon us, because if we are integrating with another ERP or CRM, those who are responsible for the CRM might come along and say, well, look, these are the things that we manage and we want you to help us manage them. So in a sense, they're almost dictating the fact that we will need to map to their world. Notice the last point. Because we're adding a little bit more power to our project, we'll once again have to focus on making it easy to read. It's very simple to implement, but not always that easy to make sure that it's readable when we're finished. So coming back to the whole concept of entities, is why would you use them? There's what I call a litmus test you can do. Is if you're faced with a scenario like this, and we're going back to our pilot candidates, and we have a question is, how old is the candidate? And then the response from either you or one of your colleagues is, well, it depends because we have multiple candidates each time we do this. So your first candidate is 21, second candidate is 50, third candidate is 45. Clearly, we can't do that without thinking about how to model the concept of a candidate so that each candidate can have its own age. And as I mentioned earlier, this is often imposed upon us because another system has already done that modeling. So this is what it looks like on screen. I'll just draw a little line you can see down here, hopefully. There we go. You can see a small yellow box down there that says the candidate. That's how you can tell if your project has implemented entities. In this case, I've added one entity to my project called the candidate. On the other side of the page, you will see here, it says all instances of the candidate. We're going to explain what each of those are referring to in a moment. But first of all, the basic principle. If you need to describe this notion of a thing, we'll call it the candidate, when you create it, make sure if your language supports that idea, because not all languages do, make sure you include the definite article. So the candidate, le candidat. Because if you don't, you might end up writing rules that really don't sound like natural language at all. If I was to say the candidate is approved, that makes sense, but candidate is approved, that's really not how you'd describe it in natural language. The second reason for doing this is because it's very important that you describe your entity first in the singular form. So the candidate, not the candidates. So the little yellow box you should always keep an eye out for, make sure that you have the singular version. The second area that I annotated down at the bottom is where we need to describe the plural. So you first describe the singular, then you describe the plural. Notice what it says down there. It says all instances of the candidate. I don't know about you, but if I walked into a room with a bunch of would-be pilots, I wouldn't turn to my colleague and say, look at all these instances of the candidate. I would say, look at all the candidates. Or I'd just say, these are the candidates. So this text, all instances of, has been proposed automatically by Intelligent Advisor, but you are free to change it, and I strongly recommend that you do. Otherwise, you'll end up writing things in Word like, what's the average age of all of the instances of the candidate, which is definitely not natural language. So let's put some terminology on this now. We spoke about the little yellow box as being where we define how we define an entity. The other section, the section down at the bottom here that I just mentioned, this is known as a relationship, and that can confuse people at first. What does it mean? It means that whenever I created the candidate, if you look on the left-hand side of the page, you'll notice that the candidate is actually below something called global, and it's slightly indented. What it's trying to show me is that the candidate is a child of, or is a hierarchical child of, something called global. And you're thinking, okay, what does that mean? When you create a project, there is always one entity to begin with, and it's called global. You didn't have to create that. It's always there and you can't delete it. If you create a new entity, it is automatically perceived as being a child of global. And you're still thinking, okay, what does that mean? It means that the candidates, in plural, they all live inside global. So if you need to access all of the candidates, you need to be able to express them as being the candidates inside global. So global, if you like, I can use a technical term, is almost like your envelope, and the candidates live inside that envelope. In terminology, we often call this a containment relationship, because the candidates are contained by global. If you look inside global, you'll see all the candidates. This vocabulary takes a little bit of getting used to, but whenever we talk about all instances of the candidate or the candidates, what we're really saying is there's a group of rows or records, we call them instances, hence the all instances. There's a bunch of instances that live inside this thing. In the previous example, we're now changing how our project is going to work. We're now going to say that each interview will involve multiple candidates. So think of it like an airline shows up and says, here are my 3 candidates. Any of them could potentially fly your plane. In this case, you might be tempted to say, well, Richard, why don't we create an entity for the candidate so we can model the candidate? But do we need to create an entity for the airline? The litmus test for this is really simple. How many airlines do you need to manage in your consumer experience? If the answer is, well, there's only ever one airline that shows up per interview, then you don't need to model the airline as a separate entity. Why? Because we just mentioned this. If I go back one slide just for a second and highlight this again, there is always an entity called global. And global is the root of your experience with your consumers. So if you're telling me I need an airline that has candidates, we can actually use the global entity to represent the airline because there's only one airline. So in this case, I would say airline is a singleton. It doesn't require anything like a new entity because there's only ever one airline. With an example and a demo, a lot of this will become a lot more clear. So in this case, I'd say we need an entity for candidate and we don't need an entity for the airline. Take a look at these 2 screenshots. On the top of the page is a screenshot relating to global. You'll notice that I've highlighted global here, and you can see on the right-hand side of the page, I've created an attribute called the name of the airline. Just because I don't need an entity doesn't stop me from giving natural language names like the name of the airline. At the bottom, you can see I've selected the candidate. And these attributes, these are all attributes that belong to the concept of a candidate. So if I have 2 candidates, there will be 2 answers to the question, the age of the candidate. One will be 50, one will be 35. there will only be one answer to what is the name of the airline, because the global entity, there's only ever one instance of it. It's the root of everything else. It's the parent of everything else. While we're on the subject of entities, how do you identify an entity? Let's imagine you have an entity called the car. How do we identify vehicles, cars? Probably with a license plate number, maybe with a chassis number. How do we identify citizens of our country? Maybe with a social security number. Lots of different entities have different identifiers. When you create an entity in Intelligent Advisor, automatically is created an attribute called the identifying attribute. It assumes that everything that you create must have some form of an identifier, which makes perfect sense, really. There has to be some way for you to distinguish between candidate 1 and candidate 2. What you use to distinguish is, at this stage, we'll say up to you. When we go to our later chapters and we talk about technical integrations, we'll see there's another role for the identifying attribute. But let's look at a practical modeler's point of view straight away. Here on the left-hand side, you'll notice that I have, in the debugger, I have two instances of the candidate, Fleur and Waylon. So I'm identifying them by their name. Then on this example, you'll notice that I have pretty much the same screenshot, except it says this is candidate 1 minus 124 and 1 minus 245. So I've chosen a different identifier for the candidates. But if you look carefully, it's still the same instances. I've simply chosen that Waylon is no longer identified by his name. He's identified by some other number, whatever 1 minus 245 is, social security, pilot registration number, or maybe even in the case of a complex integration, it's actually an identifier which is coming from another system. Maybe the other system is saying, this is the identifier for Waylon, so I need this identifier. At this stage, however, all we need to think about is, every time I create an entity, I need to think about identifiers and I need to think about relationships. Those are really the key points. So as we go into the demo, watch out for creating an entity, adding attributes, and I'll show you a couple of pitfalls, and also look out for using the debugger. Because even if you haven't yet written any rules, the debugger will come in very handy at making sure your model works the way you expect. So let's go into the demo. So I'm back in my project again, and I want you to notice a couple of things. First of all, I've created an entity, and I'm going to create another one with you in just a moment. So the candidate has been transformed into an entity. When I select global, there is now an attribute called the name of the airline. Per execution of my project, there will be one airline, but there could potentially be multiple candidates. How do I know that? Because when I click on the candidate, I see there's a relationship called the candidates, and when I click on it, it says, from global to many instances of the candidate. It's describing the world according to this project. Inside an airline, there could potentially be many candidates. We'll talk about what this notion of one, many, and so forth means in detail later on. But for now, it's simply a case of understanding what's been happening in this project. I'm going to go ahead, select the candidate, and create a new entity, and I'm going to call it the candidates exam. I'm writing it in singular format because I'm describing the thing, not yet the things. And I'll go to my relationship, and you'll notice it says from the candidate to many instances of the candidate's exam. But the text that has been provided is pretty terrible. All instances of the candidate's exam for the candidate. I'm going to change that to the candidate's exams. So this is where the plural comes in. Some words of advice. When you're building an entity, like I said before, always use the. Don't use a, because if you say a candidate and you have two, which one do you mean? It's either the candidate or A or candidate B. Secondly, when creating the relationship, make sure that you add the plural if it is to many. You want to describe in natural language how you would address the concept of many candidates or many candidates exams. When you create attributes for your entity, always make sure that in the text of your attribute, you include the entity. Use the text that you write to help Intelligent Advisor understand what each attribute actually means and what it belongs to. Here's a demo. I'm going to create a new attribute. I'm going to delete this, so go right back to the beginning, and say the pilot's exam passing score. Looks good, huh? The problem is the pilot is not the candidate, is not the candidate's exam, and isn't global. So Intelligent Advisor is worrying here, thinking, what does this actually mean? So it says, I don't know, so I'm going to stick it in global. So basically it says, I don't know what this attribute belongs to, so I'm going to put it in the top attribute. Let me show what might happen if I now try and edit the word pilot. I'm going to type in candidates. And as soon as I do that, you'll notice over here it says, okay, I figure that what you're talking about is a concept which belongs in that entity. This is a bit like saying I have 3 different boxes and each box has different things inside it. You want to make sure that each attribute goes in the right box. So my advice to you is stick to this basic principle. When you write an attribute out, the text, always pay attention that you include in the text the name, the attribute the entity you're trying to get it in. So let's click the candidate exam passing score. This already exists, so I'm going to say no. So you'll see that in each of these, I have created the attribute using the text of the candidate's exam. And each of the attributes for the candidate also include the candidate. I'm going to debug now, like we did previously. And what you might find when you debug after a few tests of your debugger is you might want to reset the debugger, which basically means if I've been working with other data or I've been working with other projects, wipe it all out and let's start again. Notice the approach this time is different. It says, okay, it's pointing to global and saying, what's the name of the airline? Because there's only one airline. I'm going to put it in. And let's call this Silver Light Airways. It's a nice name. Pity they can't spell. And I'm going to select the candidates. In the debugger, I can either right-click and add an instance, or I can click the button. I'm going to add 2 candidates. And you'll notice that I have candidate 1 and candidate 2. And each of them have their own set of data. So I'm going to select candidate 1, and I'm going to say the candidate is unknown. The candidate is Steve. And I'm going to select the second one and say the candidate is Janet. So to be technical, I have entered input values into the attribute called the candidate. And I've done it twice because I have 2 instances of the candidate. What does that mean? As you can see on screen, it now means that, if I make it a bit bigger, the candidate is Janet or the candidate is Steve. So I've identified, through the use of an identifying attribute, an easy way for me in the debugger to see which one is Steve and which one is Janet. So I'm going to go and give Steve's date of birth. Steve, let's say, was born in 1971. And let's make it easy, January the 1st. Steve is 49. Janet, we don't have an age for because we haven't entered any data for Janet. Janet was born in 1972 in February. So we have Janet's age. So we can quite clearly have multiple instances of the candidate. You may remember I added a third entity called the candidate's exams. And you'll notice it says Steve's exams. Okay, well, let's give Steve an exam. Same principle. Click on Add Instance. And let's say that Steve has passed an exam. Let's say that Steve has passed the exam P101 Flying skills, but we don't know his score and we don't know the passing score. Once again, you're seeing the benefit of an identifying attribute. Each exam is identified through this attribute, so it displays like that in the debugger. Just to finish off, in case anyone's wondering, if I go to the candidate's exam and I click Edit Entity, it's here that I can see which attribute identifies each record, each instance. If we go to the candidate and perform that again, you'll see that currently the attribute called the candidate is the identifier. Maybe we have a situation where candidates are coming from another system. So maybe there's an attribute called the candidate's technical record ID from the other system. I'm going to make that the identifier and return to the debugger. I want you to notice that Steve and Janet have disappeared because it's no longer using the name to identify the candidate. It's using this technical record ID. So let's say that the other system, this is Steve's ID in the other system. So that's how I identify Steve. So the identifier is not just for you and me in the debugger. As we'll see later on, it can be used in more technical scenarios. And that concludes our demonstration of how to build an entity and how to understand containment relationships.